and the DG of the NCCC is also the Global Methane Pledge Champion for this year. So we therefore urge all stakeholders to key into this initiative to enable Nigeria achieve its net zero pledge in a short period of time. Thank you once more, and wish you all a fruitful deliberation.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the well-crafted goodwill message. At this particular point, the support, one of the support agencies, that's the Clean Air Task Force, going to give us an overview of the Methane implementation guidelines. So to do justice to this, Dr. Mohammed Aminu, who is the Policy Manager Africa, is going to do this presentation. Please, a round of applause for Dr. Mohammed.
CATF, for those who do not know CATF, is a global environmental group that is based in Boston in the US, that has been working since 1996, to safeguard against the worst impacts of climate change. And we have been expanding ever since climate change continued to be a major issue of discussion around the world. So right now we have several programs. Methane pollution prevention is one of them. We have carbon capture and storage program. We have bioenergy and land use. We have advanced nuclear. We have energy and climate innovation, etc. And we are still growing. So I am part of the Methane Pollution Prevention Program, and it's one of those programs at CATF that has been operating outside of the United States. So for instance, the carbon capture program is mainly engaging in activities within the US, but hopefully we will continue to expand. I would also like to note that CATF had been collaborating with the NUPRC for quite some time now. During that time, the methane guidelines were developed, and we thank the NUPRC for acknowledging CATF, in these guidelines. Also, it's good to put on record that this engagement, which is going to last for 1 year with several deliverables, is supported by the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Dr. Balabapa is here. He is the Nigerian focal person for Climate and Clean Air Coalition, and they are giving the funding for this activity to support NUPRC in implementing the methane guidelines. So I will give an overview of these guidelines. I think that a lot of people here may be familiar with the guidelines, but for those who are new to the guidelines, maybe this is an opportunity for them to get to understand these guidelines. Please, I would say that Mr. Ibrahim Illo, can always chime in if he thinks I am not explaining things better. So please, if you can start moving the slides. Thank you. So here is a table of content for the presentation. So I will discuss the implementation work plan just to give an idea of what this engagement is about, and a brief overview of the guidelines and how it came to where we are, the purpose and scope of these guidelines, and other important aspects of the guidelines, as you can see here. So for this workshop, this is a sensitization workshop. So we believe that it's important to start this engagement by sensitizing stakeholders on what it means to implement these guidelines. So this is the first deliverable. We are hoping that after this workshop we'll find some time again and do a training on COMAT. So COMAT is a tool developed by Clean Air Task Force, and it stands for Country Methane Abatement Tool. We have a 2.0 version of COMAT ready now for governments around the world to use. We have been using a 1.0 version, but it's going to be ready for deployment in the next workshop. And COMAT allows government, that is regulators, to be able to determine how much methane can be reduced within the country. You know, COMAT is as effective as you want it to be. So if you have the right data, you know, the more the credibility in terms of data that you have, the better for COMAT to help in abating methane. The third deliverable is going to be a case study to demonstrate ELDA. And ELDA here is leak detection and repair in mitigating against emissions. And then we'll be developing a guidance document on fugitive methane baseline, and that will help in explaining how to implement ELDA. And in the final analysis, we will have a methodology and framework for data reporting. I think that it will be good to have a closeout, if I can call it that, a closeout session, you know, at the end, like another workshop again. But before we go in here, we are working with Carbon Limits Nigeria in delivering these deliverables. The brief overview of the methane guidelines are here. We have NUPRC in November 2022 at COP 28, I guess, approved these guidelines. So thanks very much to NUPRC again, and NUPRC issued an industry circular on methane guidelines the next month after it was approved. And in these circular, it was expected that operators will submit a GHG management strategy within 6 months of the guidelines being in effect. And this is to ensure compliance with the provisions of the net zero aspirations of Nigeria within the oil and gas sector. Can we move? Thank you. So the purpose and scope, on a high level, the purpose and scope of the guidelines is, first of all, to prevent waste of natural resources. And we know that methane is a resource, right? And the next here is, of course, to protect the environment and then help in achieving Nigeria's NDC targets in the oil and gas industry. And it's needless to say, but you know, NUPRC is the lead organization here, being the regulator in the upstream petroleum sector. So guidelines here will cover abatement measures to help achieve elimination of routine flaring, and these is going to help in reducing gas flaring by at least 100%, hopefully by 2030. And also 60% of methane emissions will be reduced by 2031. So going into some of the main parts of these guidelines or regulations, you know, we have an item here which is emission management requirements. So it is required that during design, installation and modification of facilities, there is need to submit a GHG management plan, which is going to be part of the field development plan and the front-end engineering design application, which will be approved by the NUPRC. And it's also important that installation and retrofitting of equipment will provide or rather reduce emissions in line with the guidelines. So hopefully for new facilities, you talk about installation, but for existing facilities, retrofitting is the key word here. So there is also need for proper tracking of key activities as well as the operations that will emit methane as well as fugitive emissions such as gas flaring and venting and fugitive emissions or leaks from the process equipment. Still on emissions management, the guidelines say that it's important to put in place a system that will help to identify and classify and quantify methane emissions from the process equipment themselves and also components and other sources of emissions. So there is need to also submit fugitive emissions and GHG monitoring reports to NUPRC every quarter. So now we have another item on compliance. So what is the compliance directive? Some of the key items here will be that operators will need to develop and submit a GHG management plan for facilities and operations, and this is going to be within 6 months since effective date of guidelines. I think subsequent presentations will discuss, how well or what are the challenges that the operators are facing in terms of this compliance. And this plan, that is the GHG management plan, will have to, at the minimum, cover the scope of operations and emissions, methodologies of emissions, your short, medium, long-term percentage reduction of emissions. And it's also important to note here that there is a timeline that is set to replace single cycles steam turbines with combined cycle by 2030, but this does not apply to new projects. So new projects will probably have to come with combined cycle. Thank you. Next slide. So for compliance directive, again, we have plans to achieve 2.5% reduction in energy intensity. And energy intensity is basically how much energy are you utilizing and how much can you reduce. So at least 2.5% reduction is anticipated. There is also need to submit a GHG inventory report in line with the guidelines. So the guidelines is quite, a bulky document, and there are sections in the guidelines that gives these provisions. So standards for operations and equipment leaks in facilities. It is important that monitoring of emissions is done from all the operations, such as venting and gas flaring, and leaks from equipment shall apply to all the facilities within the upstream sector. So, and this will include well production facilities, natural gas gathering compressor stations, etc. Now, you still have control requirements under methane and GHG emission and control requirements, as an important item. So in control requirement, it's important that inspection shall be conducted within 90 days. Inspection for onshore and offshore facilities, inspection of inspection technical requirements, as well as repair requirements. So if there is any breakdown, what are the repair requirements? How frequent or how fast should operators move in repairs? So we have standards for equipment. Because you work with different equipment, there is need for standardization. So the guidelines says a lot on standard for equipment, but these are, covering equipments like cold venting. What equipment do you use for cold venting, and what are the standards required? So Coal venting is simply the direct discharge of natural gas, pressurized natural gas into the atmosphere using a riser. This also covers flare efficiency, and I think flare efficiency is just how effective is combustion, the combustion process within the process engineering system. And you know, things like glycol dehydrators, liquid storage tanks. Glycol dehydrators, I believe, are the desiccation system, you know, that helps to remove water from natural gas as well as natural gas liquids. Sorry for this.
Sorry for the breakdown in transmission. We are making arrangement to call the technical people to assist the system. Just by way of reminder, if you are yet to be registered, please, the barcode is outside for you to scan so that we can have your details. It's very important for you to register, please.
No, it's still booting.
Okay. Sorry for the interruption in technology. So let's go to the next slide, please. So for greenhouse gas inventory and accounting, which is an essential part of the methane guidelines, we have monitoring requirement again. And here, operators are expected to undertake measurement of GHG emissions from their operations and report this to the NUPRC on a quarterly basis. And these requirements will apply to oil and gas production facilities, export terminals, gas processing and gathering and boosting stations. Okay, so the measurements of GHG emissions from other facilities will include facilities such as incinerators, landfills, thermal desorption units, or any other facility that will be determined by the regulator. And these calculations, that is calculations for the measurements of GHG emissions, will be done using standardized approaches. And these are approaches like the one prescribed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, or other approaches that will be determined by the regulator. And leak surveys will be conducted using series of methods. One of them here is to use the OGI cameras. So OGI is optical gas imaging camera, and CATF actually has some of these cameras that we use in mostly in Europe. Hopefully we'll get one for Africa that we can move around facilities and see emissions with them. Vapor analyzers, infrared laser beam, or acoustic leak detection instruments. So still on greenhouse gas inventory and accounting, as per the regulations, monitoring requirements stipulate that Tier 1 and 2 and 3 emission estimates should be in line with IPCC requirements, or other emissions estimation such as the API. API here should be American Petroleum Institute. And this is also subject to validation as well as approval by the NUPRC. The items here to note will be that as a minimum, operators should adopt at least Tier 1 approach within the first year of effective date of the guideline. And in subsequent years, there should be a possibility of moving to other tiers 2 and 3. And the reporting of GHG emissions shall be in line with IPCC standard, and the data should be submitted and should be subject to quality control by NUPRC and the operators. So before I say thank you, I think that the presentation might have bored you a little because it's all notes. I couldn't find a way of making it more graphical and more interactive, but hopefully subsequent presentations will be more interactive and more graphical. Yeah, so thank you very much for this opportunity. Questions will come in later, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Come in later so that we can basically take the remaining presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A big round of applause for having laid the foundation and has given us an overview of what the guidelines will look like.